Website of beer sommelier explains how full the beer over 40 years on the way.
Are we ready to go, Dave?
Pouring beer long my whole life.
Well, good morning. Is this high enough that everybody can hear? All right. Thank you. If I get any closer, I'll have to eat it. Welcome. Good to have you all here. I see everybody has picked up a paper, and that is good. I hope you take some time after the class is over to read the paper, because I do a better job writing than I do speaking some Sunday morning. And there's no extra charge for the mistakes you find. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Merciful and gracious Lord, we give you thanks again for this Sabbath day. We deeply moved by the story of the resurrection of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. We give hope to those who are hopeless, and cheer to those who are cheerless, and faith to us all. Be with us in this class. Be with our times and with this world that you have created that seems so troubled. Bring an end to the suffering in Ukraine. Bring to us new understandings of the things that make for peace. Give now to all of us the gift of your Spirit on this case. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Christ is risen. Indeed so. Or as the friend people said coming out of a church in this synod some years ago on Easter Sunday morning when I greeted them outside of church, Christ is risen, and nobody knew the answer. And some just looked the other way and walked on, and others fidgeted a little while and then smiled and walked on. And then there was a couple I've told you about many times before, probably from the Midwest, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, probably Scandinavian. And I said, Christ is risen. And they stood still for a minute, and then they responded, yeah, sure, you betcha. That works too. Today we want to stop in three significant places, two of them significant to us in our faith and our life and our understanding of our scriptures, and one of them not so much in our tradition, but still very much based on the Old Testament community called Israel. So we'll go to Jericho and then to Qumran. You've been there many times. There's still, still much to say. They're still digging 50-some years later, and new things still coming up, excuse me, new things still coming up. And then we'll go to Masada, which is just an incredible place. And they get about 750,000 visitors a year. It's the most visited place in the Holy Land. So that I suspect that will be interesting as well. So those are the places we'd like to go. And I talk a little bit about pictures before we begin, so I don't forget some things. First of all, you can almost read the sign on the front page that it says in the white area, the oldest city on the earth or in the world. I don't know which it says. My bifocals are not working this morning. And then underneath that, that's bold because water often covers it. Elisha's spring fountain. And this is in Jericho, and it's particularly significant. Page 2. Page 2, we see some excavations at Jericho, some of the oldest excavations, and also some of the oldest. This comes from the Neolithic period. We're talking about 10,500 BCE. That's before people lived in communities. That's when our ancestors were still hunters, pretty much surviving individually, making do as best we could. So that that's a long time ago. This tower dates from about 9,000 BCE. I have from the dig in Jericho, if I can believe a licensed dealer, I have a cup from a dig about this time from this general location. Was going to bring it today, but I overslept, and so I didn't grab it to go. But this is Jericho. That's a tower that's about 29 to 30 feet tall in our time. Seems to be built into the wall behind it. There's a stairwell that you can still come up and come out the hole on the top. There is even a stairway down to that level, so you can go over to the door at the bottom in the center of the picture and go up the stairway to the top. Nobody knows exactly what that tower was for, but it's from some of the earliest remnants of the oldest city on the earth in Jericho. This comes right at the seam in civilization, so to speak, when we stopped being the Tufian hunters and pretty well self-surviving on the edge of the woods, and we moved into cities, which then we could share trades. We didn't all have to be hunters, and we hadn't even discovered pottery yet. This is a long, long time ago. And it also has, if you'll look here, there's this long channel behind the tower there, going due north in the picture. That's the way archaeology was first done by what we might call archaeologists of the 18th and 19th centuries. It's called trenching. And that's how they discovered this tower. But if you look in the sides of the trench and all around the side here, you will see parts of mud bricks and all this kind of thing. You see parts of a lot of things. You have to wonder what in heaven's name was in the trench that got thrown away, because that was the first attempt at systematically doing archaeology. And there's a phrase among archaeologists: dig, dug, gone. And you can't ever go back. Once you've thrown it over here in a pile, it's gone. Now they lay a graft down in squares about 6 feet square with a 1 or 2 foot wall. They lay it out like a waffle, like a big waffle, and it's staked out with surveying tools. So it's absolutely square, absolutely precise. And then you start digging in squares, but you leave the sides of the square. It does 2 things. One, it provides a walkway for a stable archaeologist. I wouldn't be that anymore. So that you can walk from place to place. It puts everything on hold. If there's a dirt floor, you can see it in the wall. you know that probably on the other side, there'll be more of this same dirt floor. But then you begin to make records, pen and ink drawings of the walls of the bulk, in which you describe every level of occupation. At 23 levels, you'll see the word 20 in this paper. There are actually 23 levels of occupation here at Jericho. And so that as a result of that, you can actually see the levels in the wall. You follow what I'm trying to say? You're not destroying this evidence of the growth of the tell. What's a tell? A tell is a big, well, what do you have to have a city? You have to have, first of all, fertile soil for which to survive with food. Second thing you have to have is water in order to survive. The third thing you have to have is some defense. There's always been a criminal element in society. Some just marauding armies in ancient days that robbed and stole and destroyed for the sheer purpose of gathering wealth that belonged to somebody else. That happened in the ancient world as it happens today, as we see an army march into a nation that hadn't started the war to start with. So that not much changed about that. So that you built big walls, they found. Now, since I was there, which is about now 5 years, since I was there, they found the wall to the second level of Jericho, and it encircles 6 acres. That's how big the second level of Jericho was, 6 acres. And imagine putting a wall down. Now, you didn't just call the local concrete dealer and bring the whirling concrete truck up and pour it. You stacked stones and you packed them with mud. So you packed them 8 feet high, probably had a base 5 to 6 feet wide as well, because you went this way. So at any rate, you needed water, you needed fertile soil, okay? You needed a wall and protection, something that you can defend, but you also needed roads. Even in ancient days, you had roads, because when you started living in cities, you needed to trade things. You weren't a jack of all trades. You didn't, well, we didn't even, it was the third level at Jericho before somebody invented pottery, for example. As we stack up. Now look at this picture again, because over on the left side of the tower, you see a black line. Notice now this has been open to rain, which happens once a year, but my God, then it happens big time. See that black line? Can you see what I'm talking about? It runs horizontal right behind the tower on the left side. You see a black line. That black line can actually be traced all the way around the tower. What does that tell us? There was a fire. Okay, that's a fire line. Tremendously useful to an archaeologist. Disasters of the people who lived there then. But what that tells us is everything below that line, if it's unbroken, everything below that line is authentic. Why does that matter? Well, even in ancient times, people discarded their garbage by digging a pit. You could find 2nd century Roman coins at a level that it ought to have been pre-Roman times. A garbage pit really scrambles archaeology, but a bird line is a gift to an archaeologist. It tells us that everything below that bird is authentic. So all kinds of things you can read in this picture. And so we know that burn line dates now about 1550 BCE. That gets us some trouble a little bit later in the paper here. Now, let's just keep looking at pictures. I like doing that. On page 4, if you look at that top picture, you'll see what looks like a string of buildings it is. It's the Monastery of the Temptation. This is in Jericho on the Mount of Temptation, which is traditionally the place where Jesus went right after he was baptized, about 5 miles away in the Jordan River by John at Bethany beyond Jordan. And this is just to the west of the city of Jericho today. You can get up there today. If you see what looks like it's got awnings from it, that's a pretty good restaurant, I'm told. There is now why can't I say it? You know, the things that run up on a cable car that runs up there to that place. It's about 1,100 feet above sea level up there. You're up pretty high. And that's supposedly a good rate. That is actually still a functioning, but moderately so, monastery of the Orthodox Church, owned by the Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, Patriarch of the Orthodox Church in Jerusalem. Come down, we have an El Greco painting of Jesus healing the blind man, Bartimaeus. And you have two references, Mark and Luke, to that story. There's also a reference in Matthew, the 20th chapter. I didn't include it because in Mark and Luke, it tells us of one man being healed. In Matthew, it tells us about two men being healed. So it's probably the same influence. Remember, we talked about oral tradition so many times. Okay, I didn't include the Matthew thing because it doesn't exactly lay over the Matthew and Mark and Luke references, but it's worth talking. And each of these edited paragraphs, you have the reading there. And then you remember the fellow by the name of Zacchaeus, the tax collector who climbed a sycamore tree in Jericho. All right, the bus will stop here if you go on a tour. And I say, there's Zacchaeus' tree. Well, you'll see some little damage in this trunk at the bottom. And that's because they've done some real studying of that tree, and they can say, by golly, it's pretty nearly 2,000 years old. That's a long-lived sycamore tree. But anyway, that's Zacchaeus' tree, and there's Zacchaeus' story there. Then as we go down to, let's see what else we see. Go down to page 5. The first picture you see is looking outside of cave 4. There's a cave 4 picture like I've done several times. You look at the Dead Sea outside of cave 4. That's up pretty high. So you're looking over the village of Qumran there. Then keep going, next page. How did we learn about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, somebody decided, a fellow named Kanto, K-N-T-O, he's dead now. I met him, I visited his shop many times. He had the jar that Isaiah was found in his shop. But he brought them to New York and put an ad in the Wall Street Journal, and there is that ad. All right? And it tells you that it's probably useful to an institution, a major gift to a library or a museum or this kind of thing. Happens that a fellow by the name also now did, Yehiel Yadin, who was the chief architect in Israel and also general of the Israeli Defense Force as well, is in New York at that time, sees this ad, makes the contact, and arranges for the purchase of the first batch of Dead Sea Scrolls. Brings them back to England, to Israel, and that is where that saga starts for us. They then, a number of scholars got involved, and they began searching all the tombs, and now there's a total of scrolls, a few in good shape, and then lots and lots, 40,000 fragments. In the second picture, you see what they did with those fragments. This is from the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, and they are laying out all the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls face up and beginning to match those who could read the second century Hebrew, second century BCU Hebrew, which is a little different than we have today. Those who were fast with reading that began matching those things face up under glass in a room of dimmed light. And the reason was to prevent any fading, to keep them face up, also to keep them dry, because what preserved them was the dry air in the Dead Sea area. And then below that, you see the picture of cage 4, of cave 4, and the story of how they were found. You see the hole at the top, that hole drops into the cave. Bedouin shepherds were looking for a lost sheep, and they dropped a stone into this thing, and instead of hitting a sheep and hearing a baa, they heard a jar break. So they found that, and that's how the Bedouin shepherds found this. That's the beginning of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They have changed so much of our understanding. What hasn't changed is a great story. Next page completes the story of Qumran. The top of the page looks like 3 pieces of dried toast sitting on a table, looking at it from the edge. That is a photograph of the scroll of Isaiah. It's, as I recall, and I tried to research it to tell you exactly today, I couldn't find it. It's about 20 feet long and stitched together. These were skins stitched together, and so they're cut apart, but the scroll's entirely. If you see it in the Israeli Museum, and there's an exact replica of it in the Israeli Museum, the original is in a humidity-controlled, dry, mechanical environment to preserve its further deterioration. But that's the scroll of Isaiah. Then going on down, we go to Masada, and the picture you see, Herod has 2 palaces at Masada. And this is the end of one of, I call this his party palace, because there are 3 levels here. If you look, you'll see the stairway coming down the edge of the thing to level 1. I've been to level 1. I lost my nerve going down to the first level, level 2. I lost my nerve going down. There are no handrails. You just hug onto the wall and you go down the steps carved into the wall. The second level had a domed structure on it. First level had a standard column structure. There must have been, and the top was the first level. And the top levels, until you see that, those long, narrow structures there, they were granaries and storage places for wine. The Zealots, another group, not the Zealots, like just as fierce, but more theological than the Zealots. There were 4 political parties in Palestine at the time. We've all known from the Bible about the Pharisees and the Sadducees who were constantly fighting with each other. You remember that group. But there were 2 more. There were the Zealots, among whom Judas would count membership in. But then there was this third group, the Essenes, who were also mavericks, theologically in Hebrew thinking and tradition. And we'll talk about them in just a moment. At any rate, the Zealots, I'll call them Zealots because we knew about them. The Zealots that took refuge at Masada after the fall of Jerusalem managed to withstand a Roman siege for just a bit more than a year. Now there's nothing down there. There's nothing on top of this thing. There's no natural water on top of it, except they built a water system, dug cisterns into the side of the mountain. And archaeologists now tell us there was more storage of water ability in Masada than there was in the entire city of Jerusalem. so they could stand. They would taunt the Roman legion down at the bottom, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. They would taunt the legion at the bottom because these Romans are in their armor in the siege, and it's 100+ degrees at Masada almost year round. And you would hear water splashing up it because they had a swimming pool and they had a steam room and they had a bath in each of these palaces. And there were 2 of them. And, you know, they could throw water over, and they did throw water over the side on the Romans who are dying for a drink of water, but you can't drink the Dead Sea, you'll die. So it was it's an interesting story. Keep looking now for a while. This is next picture, page 8 is a synagogue at Masada. And then here you can't see much. What is the picture I have? This is the South Palace. That was the North Palace on the front point. This is the South Palace. You see, it's at a couple levels too, but it was also huge. Now, if we go to the next page, there's no more text. Here's how the Romans got into Masada. They built a siege ramp. This was built by prisoners and by slaves, and probably by Roman soldiers as well. This is the ramp that went up to the top of Masada, almost. It was big enough then, and it has not been rebuilt. This is as the Romans built it. What has happened is the spring rains have eroded it from the sides, so it's not as wide as it once was. You can walk up it. It's a bit of steep climb, but you can walk up it. And they built a siege machine, which was on wheels, and it rolled up this ramp. Think how many people it took just to roll it up the ramp. And it was a battering ram at the top of a big iron thing, kind of thing, that we get swinging on chains or on leather thong, and batter the wall or batter the door down, the gate down. That's how they finally got into Masada. When they got into Masada, they found 960 dead bodies. Yeah, and that's it.
Can you just talk about this picture? Is this the ramp here?
That's the ramp.
The thing going all the way across.
Yeah.
It's not this. It's not this.
No, it's the darker
Yeah, okay.
part. And you notice there's a platform at the bottom. There's where they built the siege machine. And then they pushed it up the hill. I can't imagine a siege machine as tall as the wall of Masada. But between that and the platform it provided, which they could hurl burning material over the wall into this top of Masada, is how they did it. The bottom picture is the last, and then we'll get to the text. Bottom picture is the last. And notice this is the cable car system at Masada. It's just left the station at the top. You are nearly at the top now. Notice the practical circle right here. Do you see the circle just below the midpoint on the ground? That's the remaining wall of one of the 3 Roman camps. Now those camps were so big. This one's not good. And I couldn't find in my file picture I have. There were 3 of these camps, equally spaced around Masada, and they were the lodging areas and so forth for the soldiers. They actually were big enough. You're 1,500 feet in the air right now looking at this. They were big enough that they had roads in them. You can see in another of the pictures, which I couldn't find, the layout like a small city inside that. That's how huge this was. They are, as the Romans left them, I mean, it is so dry here that nothing much decays or turns. And remember, most everything's built with stone. But this is one of the Roman encampments that you can see. And from the top of Masada, you can see all 3 of them. And as I said, there's another picture that actually shows the outline of one main street and two branching streets off it inside the circle. There's 3 snake paths that go up like this to walk up. In Herod's day, that was the only way to get to the top of Masada, was to walk. There were no cable cars yet. So I walked down. I have not walked up. And the reason for that is obvious. Anyhow, that's the pictures. Now let's talk about what we were. First place you want to go is Jericho.
Can I ask
Second-
can I
yes.
ask one more question? Did they have their own source of water at the top, or did they have to bring water?
They, as I said, there were cisterns carved into, and then there were on the top of Masada, there was, and the ancients did it Qumran too. There were little channels in the ground that collected water and channeled it over to the cisterns, which were, the hole would fall. And the cisterns were mostly on the side of the mountain, so they were not exposed to the sun, which would evaporate them. It's an amazing piece of engineering. It would last from one year to the next and then some. There was also barracks at Masada for the soldiers that Herod would have there. Remember this fellow, it's called Herod the Great. And Herod was of split parents. He had an Idumean father who was not Jewish. He had a Jewish mother. Now, true Jewish heritage comes through the mother. The ancients weren't stupid. You never know who the father is, but you do know who the mother is. So that the legitimate Jewish heritage comes from the father. Herod was a Jew, but half a Jew in some people's thoughts. He was appointed by the emperor of Rome, because Rome is occupying. Now, this is Rome territory at this point of the 1st century BC and CE. And Herod was appointed by, and why did we have the Zealots? Why did we have the Essenes? They hated Rome. They were terrorists of the 1st century. Their purpose was the violent overthrow of Rome in the Holy Land. That was what the terrorists were about in the 1st century, just like they come to be sometimes in ours. So Herod is appointed by the Emperor of Rome, a significant sect of Judaism, 2 political parties, Judas's party, the Zealots, and the Essenes, were organized, among other things, to overthrow the Roman rule in the Holy Land. I talked about Zealots before, and you would know about that. So I'll talk more about that when we get to the Essenes. I want to stop, first of all, to Jericho. It is the oldest city, we think, on the face of the earth. It goes back to 10,500 BCE. The city formed about 9,000. Before then, there's occupation 10,000. This is the Neolithic age, way back at the beginning of human history, as we have some record of it. Jericho is important to us for a number of reasons. First of all, we have the story of Joshua fighting the Battle of Jericho and the great spiritual Joshua, Battle of Jericho. Remember that? Well, we'll talk about that in just a moment. But Jericho itself is the oldest city. It's also the lowest. It's 800 and some feet below sea level. Good news for them is the Dead Sea is about 1,200 feet below sea level, so it doesn't blow over to Jericho. It is about, Dead Sea is about 5 miles from Jericho. And it's that climate. Why did everybody come here? Let's talk back to the tell for a moment. The reason there are 23 occupational levels, In other words, if armies keep tearing it down, why the heck do you keep building there? You keep building there because it's fertile soil. You keep building there because there's water. You keep building there because there's defense systems. It's in a preferential position. And as cities develop, you keep building there because you need roads. You need caravan trays to stop by and sell you what you don't make at your place, or maybe something you can't grow at your place. It also has the climate. Well, if you look at the first page, you'll see the climate footnote. You'll see the average temperature of Jericho, averaged all 12 months of Jericho, is well, let me find it here, 68 degrees. That's the average for the year. It never gets much below that, a few degrees. January and December get down to the terribly cold of high 60s or 70. July, 101 to 110. With plenty of water and with fertile soil, we can grow all the citrus fruits. The citrus stands in Jericho are awesome to visit. Dates, bananas. In fact, the only place I know you can buy frozen dates is in Jericho and Israel. It's the climate. So there are reasons to live there. There are reasons to live there. It's fertile. It's watered. There's a number of springs in Jericho. The most prolific of the springs is Elisha's spring. And the story of Elisha is it was not fit to drink. People died, there were miscarriages, all kinds of things. And they called on Elisha, and he threw a handful of salt in it. And ever since then, it's been running gloriously, and it has a huge flow. It still waters most of the mountain city of Jericho. It's done by this spring called Elisha's spring. And a picture of a pool that they just can keep water running and gushing in this pool. Sometimes it's up in the air, sometimes it's bubbling. There is a modern waterworks there now, but it's the Elisha spring that waters it. Now, why do people keep coming? So there's 23 levels of occupation. People keep coming and rebuilding. Each time it raises the level of what we call the tell. Why does it do that? One is what was the building material in those days? Stones and thatch roofs, this kind of thing. That takes us back all the way back to pretty much the beginning of Jericho. First there were round houses, then it became square houses. It's an interesting kind of thing as we come up to tell. I don't want to get into politics now, but it's now in Palestinian governed territory, and there's a Palestinian Antiquities Committee, national, and they have, with the help of Italian archaeologists, have been doing some incredible digs there, something the Palestinians are not known to do. Most of the time, Islamic tradition tends to deny history rather than affirm it. I'm not taking time today to talk about that. If it doesn't support Islam, you destroy it. We watch that in the news columns in extreme Islam today. So at any rate, the Palestinians have done some remarkable things. One of the things they did was find the evidence of the entire circular wall around the second level, which, as I said, encircles 6 acres. That's a pretty sizable amount of ground for an ancient city. So Jericho is the oldest, it's also the lowest city on earth, they think, and there's nobody yelling to challenge it. It's significant to us for a number of reasons. First of all, I've mentioned the tower before, but that has no particular significance except the bird line is significant, and we're going to get to that in a moment. So since Jericho was the first city the Israelites conquered when they came to the Holy Land, when they crossed over to the Holy Land, when they came matters. If they arrived in 1400, if they had left, in other words, that we have 2 dates for the Exodus, and archaeologists and historians continue to fight about those. One is as early as 1440 BCE. The other one is 1250 BCE. That's the latest one. Remember, we're counting backwards as we count BCE. We know now, and this is one of the things that's happened since the Palestinians took over. They have discovered scarabs. Now, what's a scarab? A scarab cuddle is a rounded thing, like the stone you might have in a sizable signet ring, a stone ring. A scarab is about so big, oval, carved with the name and symbols of a ruler. And since the ruler in ancient days, as now, you know, a Biden administration, you have a Trump administration, gets all the credit and all the blame for whatever goes on, they would scatter a destruction with scarabs with the name of the Pharaoh. It so happens the Egyptians conquered Jericho in 1550, and there's not much question about that. And just recently at Jericho, they found the Egyptian scarabs, which were thrown into the ruins, as they did in ancient times. Saul did the same thing. David did the same thing. When they conquered a city, they would scatter scarabs that would tell whoever came later who did it here. All right. The Romans didn't have to do that. They conquered everything anyway. But up until then. So finding the scarabs there relatively assure us, scientifically speaking, that the Egyptians were here and it was in 1550. So did Joshua walk into an already destroyed city and the people who write his coffee table books of history took credit for it? Is that what happened? Or, well, that burn line I pointed out to you is one of the things that's causing trouble. That burn line is either 1550 or 1400, because if the Israelites left Egypt in 1440 and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, because, you know, as somebody once said, Moses is like all the other men who never asked directions. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Then it would be 1400 they would have arrived here. But either that's the case, or it would have been 1200 if we take the later date for the arrival. In either case, that's significant enough time to have rebuilt Jericho, one of the several levels of Jericho. For example, if the Israelites arrived in 1400, that would have been 150 years after the Egyptians destroyed Jericho. Or it would be 350 years rather, if 1200 when they arrived. So we really still don't have a definitive answer whether really he did it, whether Joshua did it a second time. If there's 23 levels, then 23 times of destruction. Are you following what I'm saying? So now, that's where we are. We're kind of in a quagmire now. They have to say definitely. So I tend to believe the Bible. I just figured it was the second time and they tore it down. Nancy?
Are they pretty settled on the 23 levels? Like, will anybody be trying to look beyond that, or will they say, no, we have good evidence?
Well,
that
if
that's
we were
ours?
talking about Megiddo, it would be 33. And you know you're at the bottom. You say, how do you know you're at the bottom? You know you're at the bottom when you hit the rock. That's, you know, when you hit undisturbed rock formation. That's how we know it's Jericho at Megiddo. And you've heard about the Battle of Armageddon. Well, Armageddon is a contraction of words for Megiddo. And the plains of Armageddon are the plains outside of Megiddo. I'll talk about that a little bit next week because I want to talk about Solomon's 3 chariot cities. Yeah, you had a question, huh?
I didn't hear what you said. The plains of
Armageddon.
right, comes from what?
The root word to Armageddon is Megiddo.
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 And that's another place in Israel.
Next week, we're going to talk about Solomon's 3 chariot cities. You could almost argue that they had architects. Let me keep that for next week. There are 3 cities that are almost identically the same, so much so that Yudin, who I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk about it, Masada. Yudin did the archaeological digs at Hatzor, which is north, and they couldn't find a gate pillar. We got one side of the gate, but we can't find the other one. And then we couldn't find the continuation of the wall. He took his cane. He had war injuries. I told you he was an IDF general. He took his cane and they walked so many paces and stuck his cane in the ground and said, dig here. And there it was. It was exactly the same place it was at Megiddo. Are you with me? So Solomon apparently had the same architect for these 3 chariots. Now that's next week. Back to this. The whole thing is fascinating. It's all kind of an integrating puzzle as you get to look at it. You learn something here that now makes sense over here. It's a marvelous thing. So we come to on the Joshua thing. We kind of come, scientifically speaking, to loggerheads because either, you know, in the argument of when the Israelites left Egypt is based on who the Pharaoh was, because the Bible tells us who the Pharaoh was, Ramses II. And we think we know when Ramses was, and if we change that in Egypt by sliding the scale of pharaohs back to meet 1400 or forward to meet 1200, we throw the whole Egyptian picture out of focus. So we kind of, you know, does it matter much in the 21st century whether Joshua did that or not? I don't know that it probably does. Let me talk some more about Jericho, and I mean, we want to go out of time. We're almost out of time now. Why are we interested in Jericho? Well, first of all, at Bethany beyond Jordan, which is in the region of Jericho, Jesus was baptized by John. He went to the Mount of Transfiguration. You have a picture of the Mount of Transfiguration on page 4. Then we have the story of Jesus healing Bartimaeus in Jericho. We have the story of Zacchaeus, which is a delightful story. You know, Zacchaeus is not only converted, he promises, because he has been encountered by Jesus. Well, I think the better part of the story for me personally is Jesus seeing Zacchaeus up the tree and then inviting him, Jesus down And Zacchaeus invites him to come home to dinner. I did that so many times to Doris, and she didn't know I was bringing anybody home. It's just hits me as the kind of things that happen. So anyway, we're interested in Jericho for a number of reasons in our tradition. Jesus' baptism, the temptations on the Mount of Transfiguration, the healing of Bartimaeus, the conversion of Zacchaeus, who's a tax collector. And as a result of his conversion, he says something awesome. One is, I'll give half of everything I have to the poor. If I have defrauded anyone as a tax collector, people believe tax collectors got their job by bidding for it. It was always not a government official, it was always a contracted job, and you bid for it. So tax collectors always thought they had their thumb on the scale. They were considered the low of the low in society. Zacchaeus says, if I've defrauded anything, I'll first of all give away half of all I have to the poor. The second thing I'll do is, if I've defrauded anyone, I'll restore it 4 times, quadruply. Jewish law required twice. So Zacchaeus has not only given half of what he has, he offers, if he's defrauded anybody, to restore it 4 times. Neat conversion. Good story. Then let's go to Qumran. We've talked about Qumran before. I talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls already, describing the New York and Wall Street Journal ad and the pictures. Qumran we've talked about many times. You've seen Cave 4 many times. If you look to the left of page Cave 4, you will see the path of the spring rains. Look at the pattern there. It reminds me of the gravy tray they use to cut of meat. It looks like a tree, and they cut the channels for the juices down at the bottom. You can see the pattern of water in the ground comes down this ravine, and you see the lines cut on the sandstone, which makes it evident that these are levels that the water has washed out. Psalm 23, yea, though I shall, which we said this morning, yea, but with a different translation, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. I would think that would be the prayer of somebody in a hospice. But this is Psalm 23 in pictures. The only place there will be, since it only rains for 2 to 3 months of the year, the only place there'll be something for the sheep to eat is in the bottom of a ravine, because the sun is shadowed, the mounds shadow the depth of the ravine. So the sheep go down here to eat. But the shepherd is always watching the sky, because when the clouds off in a distance, it's only a matter of minutes over there before they're on top of here. And you can't get the sheep out. They are not real great animals. They don't watch clouds. So that the shepherd is one who lives under the shadow of death, meaning the coming of rain. Anyway, just to say that's where that comes from. Now let's talk about, and we've talked about Qumran several times before, so. And it's significant to us because we now have text of books that are in our Bible, chief of which is Isaiah, another one is Ezekiel. And the thing about Isaiah is there is not a significant difference told by scholars between that and what's in our Bible today. And you realize that we hand copy text for 1,500 years after Christ. And yeah.
What was it about the what was it about discovery of these Qumran caves that brought to light the Essenes? What is the connection between the caves and the Essenes? We didn't know about them from the Bible, so.
I'm sorry, I'm missing one of the things. What was it about the caves and what?
What was it about, because in your text, it says, thus began the saga of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the news of the Essenes, the ruins at Qumran, blah, 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 blah. So we first hear about the Essenes because of the discovery of.
We knew about the Essenes peripherally. The New Testament doesn't talk about them.
Yeah.
And scholars of that period knew they existed, but not much about them. Now we read their writings.
But I thought that the scrolls were only scripture. Were they also other information?
I'm sorry, I'm missing. Were there also,
So I thought that the Dead Sea Scrolls were just scripture. Were they other things?
there are all kinds of things.
Oh,
And there are also texts about the Essenes themselves.
oh,
I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear.
okay.
Actually, we know the Essenes were apocalyptic. They were people who understood themselves in the context of books like Daniel, Ezekiel, Revelations, although they wouldn't have had that latter book, but they had Daniel, they had Ezekiel. So we know what they had, but we also know what they believed in, which we didn't have any insight in before. Does that help?
Yeah.
Fine. Eric, I owe you an answer to a question too. See me after class, and I want to get to last week's question you asked. Okay. Other questions? I just stop. Yeah.
Didn't you say at one point that some people thought John the Baptist may have been seen?
I'm sorry.
Okay. Didn't you say at one point that John the Baptist, some people thought may have been an Essene?
We don't know that, but instantly, Jewish, as we understand the New Testament first century, the Jewish people had pretty much given up on baptism. They just didn't do it. It had fallen into disuse. John shows up with his baptism of repentance out of nowhere. People come from all over to be baptized by John. The Essenes were big on baptism, but they did it daily. It was a different meaning, but it was the washing of guilt, which John picked up. So there appears to be some, John disappears until he reappears at Bethany beyond Jordan. We don't know, after his birth narrative in Luke's gospel, we don't know much about John at all until he appears, So when you find a group actively practicing a thing they call baptism, and it's the same time that John is across the river baptizing, you gotta wonder.
Yeah.
Nancy.
You said that we don't really know if the Battle of Jericho happened that way or not, that maybe it doesn't matter. If we don't know that, why do we spend so much time teaching our kids about that? Is it to just teach them the nature of God and having faith and being willing to be because we spend a lot of time teaching that.
Yeah, well, Jericho has faith issues involved with it that are worth teaching, number one. Number two, it's a part of the heritage of that part of our ancestry. And you always tell stories like that.
Even if we don't know that they're true.
And frankly, nobody questioned it until the 1800s when they started digging at Jericho and found this burn line that they found in a different place. We thought we knew when they left Egypt, but that burn line has made us wonder whether we're right about the Pharaoh or wrong about the date. So it does raise a serious question. The story is still a biblical story, which has been taken and told generation by generation.
So now you're talking about Moses and Pharaoh.
I'm sorry.
So you're talking about when they left Egypt, which Jericho happened later. So we don't.
Well,
So there's lots of things we're questioning.
yeah,
Right.
it's I don't know, I can give a better answer than that. It's a toss-up at this point, scientifically speaking. It's a toss-up. Biblically speaking, it's the word. And it really doesn't have, it really isn't about how you went about it. It is really about blowing trumpets and the walls falling down. It's about what God does. And that's a teaching value.
Right.
Okay? Other questions? I got 2 minutes to finish. Well, read it, it's here. And next week, we will indeed do the 3 chapters. Are there other questions of those that are read ahead and want to go to the question? Yeah.
It wasn't mentioned, but looking at the picture of North Palace at Masada, as I recall, we were told that that is the first place that gets in the shadow as the sun sets in the west. So that would be the place to be in the afternoon because it's in the shade.
All I could think of when I got to the second level down and thought it was still a third level to go, and looked at the stairway going to that when I decided I'm not going there. But this must have been only for non-alcoholic parties too.
We declined to go to the next level down.
I did not
That's
go.
it.
Yeah, you know why? All right. It obviously is not a working palace, and you know, all the tours I've been led through at Masada, they've always said that Herod held those who came to see him there for business were met at the palace at the other end.
Oh, and another observation is talking about the number of people that visit Masada. They also bring school children up there.
Yeah.
That's one of the outings.
The idea
Every
of
child.
the Israeli Defense Force commissioned all of its officers
And they commissioner office.
with the word Masada carved in the ground and burning in flames. And they take the oath when they're given, when they're raised to command level in the idea, they take the oath at Masada that never again will this fall into enemy hands. It's a visible kind of thing that just sends chills down us. Well, we're over time now, but Eric, I want to get to the question you asked me last week, if you can remember it. Okay. I wanted you to remember that it mattered. When we got in the car, Doris says to me, you didn't answer his question. So I wanted a second chance. Now, this is about next week. The 3 chariot cities are significant because it's Old Testament history, number 1, which we didn't believe, and which we now believe in spades. If you understand the technicality of having 300 chariots at 3 different places at the same time, and having 600 horses, because it took 2 horses to a chariot for a battle situation. And you consider being on a hill where there is only limited supply of water. We'll talk about how they answered that. You began to think, probably exaggeration, 300 horses. And if you had 300 battle horses, you had another 150 in reserve for the second day, or you could only fight 1 day and leave the dead outside. So it just got to be an incredible expectation. Well, it appears that he pretty nearly did. And archaeology could, we found the stables where the horses were. And there's troughs 6 feet long where they were fed, mangers. And a hole at each end of the manger, which would suggest tethering a horse at each end, maybe at both sides. And it's a beauty. A 12-year-old child can stretch out in this manger Well, there's enough of them, Megiddo and even on down at Gezer to suggest but it may have been Solomon's successor, but there were in fact that many horses and that many chariots, which look logistically, horses are hay burners. You've got to have feed, you've got to feed them, you've got to water them, you've got to care for them. And apparently they did it. Next week we'll talk about that. Thanks for being so patient with me. There's a lot of good stuff in here I didn't. Well, I guess it's not outrageous to think you can bring the questions after you read it next week.